Iran. We are learning about the history, Jewish community history, what it was like, the science behind it over here on this special edition today. And we plan to educate and learn. This is already part number 3. And we're speaking more around the 1800s eras today. It's going to be a multi-part series over here. Something I very much have to point out about. And the previous installments, we did speak about some of the famous rabbis that of yesteryear that were famous figureheads, including, we really spoke about people, great personalities, famous personalities, like the Mullah Yehuda Simantov, for example, who was a member of the Yaz family, who was famous, let's just say, at the time period of the major famine in 1770. I think he was a key part of that family history. We're going to speak about other rabbis today inside this series. We spoke about the Rabbi Ben Farhad, who was a famous Persian Jewish chronicler. We mentioned about him in yesterday's or the previous classes. I think Rabbi Ben Lot, we spoke about him. He died in 1662. We spoke about him. He was a Jewish poet and a historian in the 17th century of Safavid Iran. So we did speak about him. Now I want to start off this edition talking a bit about Judeo-Persian. To start about that in this series, and we're going to speak more about that specific era, delve into a few of the communities and a few of the rabbis also respectively over here. Okay, so what is Judeo-Persian first of all? It refers to both a group of Jewish dialects spoken by Jews and Judeo-Persian texts written in the Hebrew alphabet. As a collective term, Judeo-Persian refers to a number of Judeo-Iranian languages spoken by Jewish communities throughout, let's say, the formerly extensive Persian Empire, including Iranian Jews, Mountain Jews, Afghan Jews, and Bukharian Jews also respectively. So that's it's native, this language, to many countries. You could say also to Israel, Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Russia, Dagestan, respectively, many places over there. It's part of a whole language family. Judeo-Persian is also, along with other Judeo languages in and of itself. So the speakers itself, they refer to their language as Farsi, obviously. Some non-Jews refer to it as a Yidi, also means Zidi or Judi or Jidi, which means Jewish in a, maybe, let's say, in more derogatory sense for them. There's an extensive Judeo-Persian poetic religious literature closely modelled on a classical Persian poetry. The most famous poet was someone of them, we did speak about this poet in the previous class, Maulana Shahin-i Shirazi, 14th century Common Era, who composed, let's say, various epic versifications of parts of the Torah, you could say, such as a Musanama, which is a Bible, a recounting story of Moses, for example. Other famous later poets that composed, let's say, lyric poetry in style of Persian mysticism. Much of this literature was collected around the beginning of the 12th century by the Bukharian rabbi Shimon Hacham, who founded a printing press in Israel. Very interesting this happens to be. Let's talk about earliest Judeo-Persian writings over here. Now, the earliest evidence of Judeo-Persian writing dates back to the 8th century over here. So we're going back quite a bit here. These documents, written in Hebrew script, document the existence of Jewish communities, let's say, writing in Judeo-Persian across historical Persia. There's archaeologists, for example, they worked, let's say, during the 20th century, in the 1900s. They discovered Judeo-Persian writings in locations as far spread as southern India, and various provinces, also in Cairo, present-day Iran, Afghanistan. They include court documents, trade documents, headstones, stone inscriptions, and works on religious matters, we have to point out over here. Let's talk a bit about the biblical epics. Over there was Maulana Shahin-i Shirazi over here. This was, let's say, the most famous Judeo-Persian, as we mentioned about before, in the 14th century poet we mentioned before, and talked about this poet would do various different biblical poems connected, based on the Pentateuch, the Torah, and the second centered on the Book of Esther, the Megillat Esther, respectively, and the Book of Ezra, which is part of the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, respectively, over there. And it's actually interesting. In his writing, Shahin uses a language typical of his era, the classical Persian, and does not employ over there the same level of Hebrew words as other Judeo-Persian writers over here. Yeah, so let's talk about the Pentateuchal epic. What is that? Shahin's Pentateuchal epic cycle consists of 10,000 metered couplets, versification of the books of Exodus, of Leviticus, of Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This is obviously the book of Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and also the Devarim, respectively, written, I think, in the year 1327. And there's 8,700 couplet length versification of Bereshit, Genesis, which was composed in 1358. Like, he focuses on narratives from the Torah and from other literatures from other religions also, if I'm not mistaken, so that I have to point out. I think fashions his biblical epics of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the most renowned Persian epic in the Persian, let's just say, mythology in of itself, including styling Moses as heroes from Persian epic heroes, contributing to the glorification of Moses' prevalence in Judeo-Persian literature. And very, very interesting. I think it will omit other parts of the Tanakh, the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim also, we have to point out over there. But I'll recommend everyone to just look into that from a historical point of view. I think he has 9,000 method couplets that adapt narratives from the book of Esther, Nehemiah, from Ezra. This, I think, in Ardashir Nameh, if I'm not mistaken. He also includes non-biblical storylines that parallel the Shahnameh and the Nizami's Hamsa over there, and it recounts over here the biblical narrative of Ardashir and Esther, and very, very interesting enough, and other things also, but a famous poet himself. Then there's Emrani. What is Emrani? It was a 15th century Persian poet who, like Shahin, wrote Persian in Hebrew script. He was, I think, Imrani was born in Isfahan, and he would move to Kashan in his 20s and lived there until his death. There's a 10,000 verse Fathnameh adapts the book of Joshua, Ruth, and Shmuel, Aleph, and Bet, and like Shahin's biblical epics, it displays a strong Shahnameh influence. His Hanukkah Nameh is, I think, shorter, 1,800 verses in of itself, and let's say there's versification of the Maccabees' rebellion against the Greeks, and there's a work, I think, in 1524 relies heavily on the apocryphal first book of the Maccabees, which we have to point out over here. I'm just reading this from Wikipedia over here, employing a more Hebrew vocabulary than Shahin did, and relies more on narratives from the Torah and rabbinic literature also, respectively. So that's very interesting. Then there's the Shoftim Nameh. What is that? That was written in 1692 by, I think the name was Aaron ben Mashiach, or I'm not too sure his name. Totally. I think it's a versification of the book of Judges, Joshua, naturally, using the same meta of Imrani's Fathnameh. But then there's a Daniel Nameh, which is in 1606, I think, it was the Kahjah of Bukhara, the versified narratives from the book of Daniel, Apocrypha and Midrashim of rabbinical commentaries. Very interesting enough. And that's something that we have to point out. Then, and so from Shimon Hacham, would give a commentary, I think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe on Exodus at some point. Who was Shimon Chacham? He was a famous Bukharan rabbi who later emigrated to Jerusalem. He edited and published at least 29 works in Judeo-Persian, including a complete edition of Shahin's Torah commentary. He included alongside the edition his own prose commentary on the book of Exodus over there. There's various historical texts that we mentioned in the previous class with regards to the Babei Be Lutf. He was a 16th century Jewish author and a historian born in Kashan. He has a 5,000 couplet length Kitab-i Anusi. He recounts the persecution of Iranian Jews under the reigns of three Safavid Shahs. There's Abbas the first, the Safi the first, and Abbas the second, who collectively reigned from 1571 to 1666, focusing, let's say, on the forced conversions of Jews during the time. Very, very interesting enough. Then we mentioned about Babi Farhad, Farhad in the previous one. Ibn Luft's grandson was someone named Babi Farhad. He composed a 1,300 couplet chronicle on the persecution by Jews in Kashan, and during the Afghanistani invasion of Iran, it was, which, let's say, occurred between the years 1722 to 1730. The Ibn Farhad described the conversion of Jews in Kashan to Islam, and how they allowed return to their faith 7 months later, also interesting enough. So there's various different liturgical poems also. There's a Hafta Bar Adaran. What was that? That was an epic poem by Imrani, which actually read on the Tanit of Tisha B'Av, based on the story of Hannah and her 7 sons, which also we learn about in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. There's a Shishom Dar. What is that? That's a poem read on the Jewish festival of Shavuot. It details, let's say, the commandments based on Azharot literature. Then there's a Shiraya Hatani. This is Shira, often beginning with the words Shodi Hatan Mubarak Bad. The verses that is sung in various different weddings and at different smachot. I think it's originally composed for the groom during the Shabbat Chatan, also, which Shabbat Chatan obviously is Shabbat after the wedding in of itself. Now, let's talk a bit about the printing press in Iran. What printing they have? I think in the late 19th century, Jerusalem became a center of printing Judeo-Persian literature at that point in time. Works from many genres were printed, as well as translations of non-Jewish works into Judeo-Persian. Some of the major figures of this movement included Jewish people from Central Asia and from Shimon Chacham. And I think it was in 1917, a society for the promotion of Hebrew language was established in Tehran alongside Judeo-Persian and Hebrew printing press. This group also published a Judeo-Persian newspaper. It was called the Hag'ula, and there were 2 other Jewish, let's say, Judeo-Persian newspapers were also published in Bukharia and also in Samarkand. Very, very interesting enough. So that's very interesting. Friends, anyone tuning in live, we're a community. We're exploring, let's say, the history of the Persian Jewish community here on this special edition, and we're talking about this already, the part 3 of it. So welcome to anyone. If you are new here, welcome to our community, and don't forget to, if you're tuning in live now, please subscribe to the channel and join. And we're trying to get to 9,000 subscribers, Bezrat Hashem, hopefully by Rosh Chodesh Adar. Let's see if we can get to that. It'll be a phenomenal achievement over there. So we're talking about the 2 Jewish newspapers will come out and will publish in Bukhara and Samarkand also, respectively. So that's very interesting. Now let's talk a bit more about some of the different regions in Iran that were prominent of yesteryear. We were talking about more 19th century in the previous class. Let's talk a bit about the harassment of Jewish people in Persia. I think it was in the mid-19th century. There was someone named J.J. Benjamin. He would write about the life of Persian Jews. I'm not too sure which city he's referring to, but he is quoted over here. They are obliged to live in a separate part of town, for they are considered as unclean. I'm not going to say the terminology he uses over here. Under the pretext of their being unclean, they are treated with the greatest severity, and should they enter a street inhabited by Muslims, they are pelted by the boys and mobs with stones and dirt. You can see how bad the anti-Semitism was. For the same reason, they are prohibited to go out when it rains, for it is said that the rain would wash dirt off them, which would sully the feet of the Muslims. And he adds over here, if a Jewish person is recognized as such in the streets, he's subjected to big insults. Passers-by, they can do things like spitting, for example, and even beating unmercifully. If a Jewish person enters a shop for anything, he's forbidden to inspect the goods. Should he touch them, the goods, he must take them at any price the seller chooses. You can really see the terrible, terrible anti-Semitism there was all throughout Jewish history. Sometimes the Persians intrude into the dwellings of the Jewish people and take possession of whatever pleases them. You can see this is a form of torture, this is. Should the owner make the least opposition in defense of his property, he incurs the danger of atoning for it with his life. A Jewish person shows himself in the street during the 3 days, I think, of the Katel, the Muharram, over there. What's going to happen to him? I think his life could be at risk. That's how bad it was. I think it was in 1868. And I'm just reading this from Wikipedia. The British Charge d'Affaires in Iran, his name was Sir William Taylor Thomson. He wrote Iranian Jews are mostly very poor, and excepting in Tehran and some major cities, are much, let's say, prosecuted and oppressed by the Mohammedans over there. Often Iranian central government wished to help the Jews, but did not have influence in places where local rulers and Shia clergy were powerful. In one incident, over there of this type in Hamadan in 1875. An argument occurred between a Jewish goldsmith and a customer. Eventually, a crowd gathered, and the goldsmith was accused of blaspheming Islam, a crime worthy of capital punishment in Islamic legal law. People started beating the Jewish person up. He had to flee. He fled to a mujtahid, an Islamic scholar, house, who sought to send him to the government authorities. However, people were so angry, they broke into the house and killed him and burned his body. You can see how brutal the anti-Semitism was. There was someone named Sir William Taylor Thompson contacted Iranian authorities about this at that stage in time, and this matter, and levy tax was imposed on all Muslim population of the city. This will anger the population even more, and all of them gathered to stone the Jewish person. And the governor and the Shah's agents, the Jewish Board of Deputies, sent gratitude to William Taylor Thompson for intervening on behalf of the Jews. Now, I think there was even a bad street song which was common in Tehran in the 19th century, which demonstrated a negative view of the average Persian Muslims towards the Persian Jews in itself. I'm not going to say over the song over here because it's just so bitter to actually state over within regards to this over here. Now, friends, anyone tuning in live, welcome to our community as we are exploring the Jewish community history within regards to Iran. Now, I think it was in the 19th century there were many instances of forced conversions, and unfortunately there was a lot of massacres that would take place, usually inspired by the Shia clergy over there. I think it was in 1830 the Jews of Tabriz were massacred. The same year saw a forcible conversion of the Jews of Shiraz, and I think in 1839 the Al-Haddad occurred. Many Jewish people were massacred in Mashhad, and survivors were forcibly converted. However, European travellers later reported that the Jews of, I think, Tabriz and Shiraz, they would continue to practice Judaism in secret despite a fear of further persecutions. In 1860, the Jewish people of Hamadan were accused of mocking the Taziyah ceremonies of the Imam Hussein. Several of them were fined, and some had their ears and noses cut off as punishment. Jewish people of, let's say, the Barfurush were forcibly converted in 1866 when they were allowed to revert to Judaism thanks to an intervention by the French and British ambassadors, and a mob will kill 18 Jews of Barfurush over there, burning 2 of them alive. You can see we saw October 7th, obviously that was much larger scale, but this is just glimpses of how cruel they could be at that point in time. The representative of the Alliance Israelite Universal, that was a Jewish humanitarian and educational organization at that point in time. We actually did record a video about the history about, which I very much recommend people to watch those videos, which we recorded on the Alliance in of itself. So I think they would weigh in, the Alliance, they would actually write over there at that stage in time. I'll quote, I'm just reading Wikipedia, from Tehran in 1894, every time that a priest wishes to emerge from obscurity and win a reputation for piety, he preaches war against the Jewish people. I think it was in 1910 the Jews of Shiraz were accused of ritually murdering a Muslim girl. Muslim dwellers of the city plundered the whole Jewish quarter. The first to start looting were the soldiers sent by the local governor to defend the Jews against the emerged mob. 12 Jews who tried to defend their property were killed, and many others were injured at that point in time. So very interesting. Once again, anyone tuning in live, we're exploring the Jewish community of Iran. Please subscribe to the channel and join our community, as we are one only place in the English language that will go into all the Oriental, Asian, North African countries to delve in the history. One of the few places that does it in English language. Now, it's interesting. Lord Curzon will describe the regional difference in the situation of the Persian Jews in the 19th century. In Isfahan, where they were said to be 3,700, and where they occupy a relatively better status than elsewhere in Persia, they are not permitted to wear collar or Persian headdress, to have shops in the bazaar, to build the walls of their houses as high as Muslim neighbors, or to ride in the streets. In Tehran, in Kashan, they are also to be found in large numbers and enjoying a fair position. In Shiraz, I believe, and he goes on over here and is stating in his thing. And I think there was one European traveller in 1880 would write, hatred harbored by the Gentiles of Kermanshah towards the Jews is not overdone as in Central Persia. In 1860, there was someone named Rabbi Y. Official said about the Jews of Isfahan as beaten from all sides by the Gentiles. Another European traveller reportedly, let's say, more degrading ritual to which Jews are subjected for public amusement. At every public festival, even at the royal salam salute before the king's face, the Jewish people are collected, and the number of them are flung into the house or tank, that king and mob may be amused by seeing them crawl out, half drowned and covered with mud. The same kingly ceremony is witnessed whenever a provincial governor holds high festival. There are fireworks and Jewish people. Okay, that's what's stated. In other times, I think there'll be attacks on the Jews were related to their association with the foreigners. I think there was an event of this sort would occur in the 1836 when I think there's someone named Elias, who was a Jewish banker from the British residency in Bushehr, was attacked for doing business in the bazaar over there. There was anti-Jewish acts at that time, were sometimes linked to resentment of European powers. And in January 1924, the JTA, the Jewish Telegraph Agency, reported that a mob of Muslims had attacked the Jewish population of Tehran and injured 6 Jews, but were prevented from killing anyone by the intervention of the police over there. So very interesting. Let's talk about Jewish community international relations. Now, I think in his time, or in this time, Iranian Jews who were aware of the growing influence of European Jews in global affairs and turned to them for assistance. I think in 1840, the Jewish community of Hamadan sent an envoy, someone named Nissim Bar Seloma, to meet Western Jewry. He went to England and met with Moses Montefiore, who provided certificates against accusations of the Jews. I think it was from 1860. Many attempts were made by the Persian Jewish community to secure assistance from European Jews against Muslims. These requests were full of descriptions of poverty and persecution faced by the Jews in Persia. The following is one example of such requests over there. Let's say there was representatives of the Alliance Israelite Universal, we mentioned about a few minutes ago. They recorded numerous instances of persecution and debasement of Persian Jews. In many of these cases, envoys from foreign governments such as British, French and Ottoman intervened on behalf of the Jews to avoid more serious repercussions. And there are 3 international Jewish organizations: Alliance Israelite Universal, Anglo-Jewish Association and Board of Deputies of British Jews. And there were 2 people that we mentioned about here on the series, some named Adolphe Klemiux and Moses Montefiore. They were instrumental in securing equal rights for the Iranian Jews and protecting Jews in anti-Semitic incidences over there. I think at that point in time there was a growing influence on the United States in international affairs. Many American Jewish organizations, such as I think there was American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, they would actively intervene on behalf of Persian Jews during the Great Famine of Persia in 1917 to 1919. There was a JDC representative, someone named Albert Lucas, would successfully convince the US government to donate $15,000. I think it was an amount of $200,000 in 2015 US dollars, let's just say, to Persian Jewry. The JDC of Philadelphia donated $10,000 in September 1918. Remember, Philadelphia had a very, very large Jewish community, especially Sephardic one, I think, in the early 20th century. Thus, the casualty of famine against the Persian Jews was minimal in comparison to Persian Gentiles. Furthermore, when the Jewish neighborhood of Bushehr was attacked by Lurs, the JDC sent a large number of donations. US Ambassador Caldwell was also instrumental in helping the Jews of Bushehr, also respectively, over there. So that's very, very interesting. So let's talk about a bit more now about the rabbis of Iran during the earlier time periods. Remember, this is going to be a multiple part series. I plan maybe in the next edition, we're going to start speaking about the synagogues of Iran. That'll be the next thing, and then going more in delving into history. So we're going to speak about a couple of key rabbis today. But I think around 1850, the Jewish community in Iran, particularly in cities like Hamadan, was served by local leaders known as mullahs. I think one rabbi was Rabbi Mullah Ibrahim in Tehran. He was an influential leader from Baghdad acting as a judge and communal leader, and the community of Mashhadi Jews under forced conversion who maintained secret leadership, if I'm not mistaken. I think, I'm not sure, maybe he had the position in 1848, I've got to double check, but Mullah Abraham would serve as a chief rabbi and a goldsmith, I think reports over, handling legal and religious affairs over there. I have to double check all this information, I haven't got too much on there. There was also another famous rabbi, I think, there was in 1839 there was a Al-Haddad incident, and Jews in Mashhad would practice Judaism in secret. There was some name, Rabbi Mordechai was known as Mullah Murad, was born in 1850. I think his name was Rabbi Mordechai Eikler. He became a significant leader in the community and eventually in Mashhad, and maybe in India at one stage in time, in Jerusalem. We're going to speak about him in due course. So there was other notable, especially in 1860, the Jewish community in Iran, particularly in Hamadan and Tehran, was served by local rabbis and dayans, navigating difficult social situations. There was someone named Rabbi Eliezer Chaim, ben Rabbi Mullah Elisha, was active in Hamadan between the years 1840 to 1860. And he was known for polemical, philosophical works, if I'm not mistaken. And he was a dayan. He was the author, I think, of the Chovot Raphael, Duties of Raphael, which was a Judeo-Persian treatise over there. So that's very, very interesting. I think Rabbi Yehiel Fischel Kasselman would visit Hamadan in 1860 and reported on the community's view, as we spoke about here in the previous class in of itself. So let's talk about a bit the history of Hamadan over here, now using the Jewish virtual library. So what is Hamadan? It's situated on the western part of Iran. Hamadan is Achmata of the Bible, as we see in the book of Ezra in chapter 6 verse 2, which was a capital city of the Medes, and before Common Era, way before. It is probable that the Jews who were deported from Samaria to Media, as we learn about in the book of Kings, second book of Kings, in chapter 18, by the Assyrian king Shalmaneser, also would settle in Hamadan. The city was called by the Achaemenid kings who replaced the Medes around the year 550 BCE. Hangmantania, Agbatana, and Akbatana, probably meaning gathering place. And I think the biblical name there was of Achmatha does not occur in the Talmud. Instead, we find there the name HMDN. The Persian Jews identify Hamadan with Shushan Abira, which obviously is a mistake. I think, very, very interesting. I think Benjamin, the famous Benjamin, he was a famous traveler. We spoke about him before. He would have a travelogue. I think in his page 57, he was like, let's say, more of the earlier Jewish records, which mentions the tradition held by Persian Jews regarding the tombs of Esther and Mordechai in Hamadan. They're very much connected to the Purim story. The tombs are also mentioned by the Judeo-Persian poet, I think of the 14th century, Shahin, and about 300 years later by Babai ben Lutf. And there's an archaeologist of the name Ernst Herzfeld. He was between 104 to 107. He suggested that the queen, Shushan Docht, the wife of Sasanian, the king of Yazdegerd, is buried under the Muslimah. However, Jews and Muslims alike regard these tombs as a holy site. The tombs are visited, especially during Purim, in the month of Adar, by the Jews from all over Persia. Very interesting enough. Now, the Rashid al-Dawla was a great Jewish scholar, historian, and the first vizier of the Lycans. Was born in Hamadan in the year 1247, and I think he was accused of plotting the murder of the Ikan and executed in 1318. The Jews of Hamadan, like Jews of many towns all over Iran, suffered mortal persecutions and forced conversions during the Safavid period between 1501 to 1736, like we spoke about in the previous class. Their suffering obviously was recorded in the chronicles of the Babai ben Lut, which we mentioned about before. Now, according to someone named David de Bet Hillel, who visited Hamadan, I think in the year 1827, there were 200 Jewish families living among 100,000 Muslim inhabitants in Hamadan. Some Jews were physicians, others were goldsmiths or wealthy merchants. The city also had about 1,000 Armenian families. Now, Benjamin II, I think it was in Hamadan in 1850 and reported that the city had 500 Jewish families that had 3 synagogues and 3 rabbis. Now, 2 years later, the missionary Stern visited Hamadan for the purpose of converting its Jews to Christianity. He claimed that the Jews of Hamadan were enthusiastic to purchase and read the New Testament, which is obviously a very bad thing. We are totally against missionaries over here, and you know my opinion on that over here. I'm just reading what the Jewish Virtual Library says about this at the moment over here, so I'm going to state that unequivocally over here. We have nothing to do with any other things. We believe in total Orthodox Judaism over here on this channel. So he reported that 500 Jewish families, Stone will visit Hamadan for the purpose of converting the Jews to Christianity. Obviously, we hope he claims that the Jews of Hamadan were enthusiastic to purchase and read the New Testament. But by the way, I'm going to state on onset, sometimes a lot of these people are lying, to try and push their own agenda. That we see. He would report that 500 families lived in the city in their own separate mahalla, and would complain about the harsh treatment of the Jews or the Muslim clergy. And remember, I don't think it's true necessarily about the New Testament thing over there. Now, once again, key figure, Rabbi Yehiel Fischel Kasselman visit Hamadan in 1860 and described most of the Jews of the city as wealthy, but was hated by the Muslims. So just quoting over here. I'll be someone named Ephraim Newmark. He visited Hamadan in 1884 and wrote of the Jewish poor over there. He also described the solicitous efforts of the Christian mission in Hamadan, which opened a school in the city that Jewish children attended free of charge, and also helped the poor families materially and financially. Remember, that's a very bad thing also, that they will do that, because unfortunately people will be victim to this. Then he says that it's not a family in Hamadan that has not been touched by the blight or the Baha'is bearing the banner of the mission. And what will happen when the faithful Jewish boys grow up in a missionary school? God only knows. The beginning of the blight, let's just say, was evident among the Jews first in Hamadan, from which it spread to Tehran, Kashan, and elsewhere. Those who left the Jewish faith from this creed found refuge from the wrath of the king, Nasser al-Dishan. So it didn't help them to leave Judaism at the end, in the shadow of Christian mission. So you can see it didn't help. Just shows how bad it is to listen to these missionaries and some of that, and you should have stayed the truth to their religion, and which lay in the wait for their souls in the terror of the king. It served as a sheltering wall. According to Newmark, there was about 800 Jewish families in Hamadan, approximately 150 of whom were Jews who had converted into the Baha'i region over there. I think in the year 1892, there was a specific fanatic, someone named Mullah Abdallah in Hamadan, who issued a fatwa to kill the Jews of the city if they refused to abide by restrictions imposed upon Jews, such as wearing the Jewish patch. Later they were ordered to embrace, I think, Islam to the death penalty. And for about 40 days, Jews were afraid to leave the mahalla at that point in time. The intervention of the central government, together with the British consulate, prevented a brutal massacre. There's someone named Levy, I'm not sure his full name. He would narrate an event and argues that if one recalls the severe persecutions led by Mullah Abdallah and the warm, friendly, supportive attitude of the Baha'i inhabitants towards persecuted Jews who were on the verge of annihilation, one can also understand a mutual affection evinced by believers or those religions in Hamadan. Now, I think Mr. Levy will actually point out that during this time, about 30 Jews from the community's elite in Hamadan were forced to convert to Islam, and later some of the converts turned to the Baha'i religion. According to Levy, I think the positive approach would demonstrate by some of Hamadian Jews towards the Baha'i region also rubbed off on Tehran's Jewish community and the other provincial towns. So I have to point out over there. There's someone named Yehuda Kopelevitz Almog. He visited Iran in 1928. He referred to the Jewish Women's Organization in Hamadan, which was founded around the year 1910. Kopelevitz mentions over there that one paragraph, number 12, in the Charter of the Hadassah Society for Jewish Women in Iran, Hamadan stated that the society endeavors to influence the Jewish women not to take part in the Baha'i meetings. And I think there was handwritten papers are kept in the Ben Tzvi Institute in Jerusalem. And I think there's another famous geographer, someone named Dr. Abraham Jacob Brewer. He visited Iran in 1935, and during his visit to Hamadan, he was given an estimated number of 8,000 Jews out of a total Jewish population of 100,000. And very, very interesting enough. So now let's talk a bit more about the science behind it. Who were the other rabbis there? Apparently, during the Qajar dynasty in 1870, obviously we talked about the huge amounts of discrimination that came among the Jewish people. There's a prominent figure at that point in time, a Rabbi Moshe ben Isaac Chazan, or Rabbi Moshe ben Yitzchak Chazan. He served as a chief rabbi, apparently reported over of Iran, and held this position between the years 1870 to 1906 over there. Very, very interesting enough. So we know that the Jewish people would face special taxes, professional restrictions, and in some cases, unfortunately, violence also, which is very, very interesting enough. Let's talk a bit now about the Mashhadi community also. Also, I'm partly Mashhadi over here, I have to stress it out. Now, many of the Jews of Mashhad, including the chief of the local Jewish community, someone named Mullah Makdi Akajan, served as agents of the British government. I think this fact, in addition to the recent withdrawal of Iran from Herat, this was in 1838, it was under diplomatic pressure from the British government. It created an increasing hostile atmosphere towards the Jews of Mashhad. This event transformed, let's say, the group of Iranian Jews into community. Was Al-Habadad, which meant God's justice, I think of 1839. There was rising social tensions, resentment and suspicion by Shiite Muslims of the Jewish inhabitants of Mashhad's, let's say, Edgah ghettos, culminated in an explosive event. I think it was a blood libel on the Muslim holiday of Ashura that led to a devastating pogrom. On March the 27th, 1839, 36 Jews were killed and approximately 7 Jewish girls were abducted to become Muslim child brides. And I think within the next 24 hours, under the risk of death, approximately 300 Jewish families made the pretense of converting to Islam under the advisement of their community leaders, I think, at that point in time. The term Al-Haddad was coined by, I think, the forced converts, if I'm not mistaken, to relate their past sins with the calamity they were enduring. I'm just reading this from Wikipedia over here. Following the forced conversions, a number of Jewish families unable to sustain the facade of the Muslim faith escaped to Herat in 1840. It is estimated that the remaining community members proceeded to live dual lives as convert Jews. During this time, the Jadid al-Islam, a term meaning new Muslims, boasted of 2 known Shiites, 57 known as Hajis, and 21 known Karbalais. While preserving their secret Jewish identities, their ties to Islamic religion were complex at times. I think it was in the year 1886. Mashhadi Jews gradually migrated to Marv and surrounding areas of Saris Turkmenistan, and I think there was an effort to escape persecution in Mashhad and look for better business opportunities, I think, in the Russian Empire. Interesting that. I think it was in 1890, Muslim Mashhadi attempts to expose secret Jewish burial proceedings of covert Jews. A potential pogrom was averted. In 1890, after completing the Hajj, some Mashhadi Jews made Aliyah and traveled to Jerusalem instead of returning from Mecca to Mashhad. We have to point about that. 20th century, I think in 1901, we'll see the Haji Adonia HaKohen built the first Jewish Mashhadi synagogue in Jerusalem, followed by Haji Yeheskel synagogue built in 1905. In 1910, some Mashhadi Jews moved to London. In the autumn of 1917, the Russian Revolution caused the first return of Mashhadi Jews from Marv to Mashhad, and Mashhadis who remained in Russia fell prey to Stalin's purge of petite bourgeoisie, and some members of the community unfortunately were imprisoned at that point in time. Let's speak now about a few rabbis more in depth over here. The first one, probably one of the most famous rabbis, Rabbi Mordechai Ekela. He was born in 1850. He died in 1936. I think the 5th of Tammuz is his Hilula. He was arguably the most famous rabbi from the Anusei Mashhad in of itself, and was a translator of various books. He was born in Mashhad in Iran in 1850, and he died in Jerusalem, which was part of Palestine at that point in time. And he was buried in Har HaZeitim, and he would make Aliyah actually in 1927, 25th of September, to be precise, I believe, on that date. He would write various Torah colossal books, which we can talk about. And I think he was married several times. I think to Rabbanit Yocheved Bat Moshe, if I'm not mistaken, and then to Yocheved Bat Rafaela Kohen, and Ubat Sion, if I'm not mistaken, who was his second wife over there. So he was born in Mashhad in 1850. His father's name was Raphael, and very, very interesting enough. Nulad Mashhad in the 1850, לרפאל, 20 שנה לאחר שבני הקהילה נאנסו להתאסלם. למד מאביו תנ"ך, he learned from his father Torah נביאים וכתובים בגיל צעיר, at a young age, והמשיך בכוחות עצמו בלימוד המשנה וגמרא. He would learn by himself Mishnah and Gemara. את אשר למד תרגם לשפה העדה ודרש בפני הקהל. He would give over various different sermons and would translate it. הרב היה עובר בלילות מבית לבית ללמד את הילדים הנוסעים במשהד תורה ולחנוכם במצוות. בדור הראשון לאניסות הקימו הרב יוסף כהן ומולה כדור הדת בתי כנסות, כל אחד מרצפו. הרב מרדכי שהיה רב קהילה בדור השני לניסת פתח בביתו בית כנסת נוסף, וכך עשה גם רבי בנימין אמינוף at that point in time. So remember, the Aminov family was also quite close to the Mashadis. בבית הכנסת שניהל במרתפן, לימד הרב מרדכי את הנערים המצטיינים. He would learn and educate the excellent, let's say, younger students, דינים והלכות, teach them Jewish laws. תלמידים לרב הפיצו את מה שלמדו במרתפם או בתי כנסיות אחרים. לבית הכנסת הקטן הגיע הציבור מדי שבת לשמוע את דרשות פרשת שבוע מפי הרב. He would give over various different sermons, especially with regards to Parshat HaShavua over there. מונה על ידי הקהילה לרבם בשנת 1883. He would be appointed the rabbi of the Kehillah in 1883. כרב העדה פסק עבור בני עדתו סידי קידושין בסתר. He would, because of the forced conversions in Islam, they had to keep it quiet how Jewish practices they were doing. So he would do the weddings in secret. מלאת בני הקהילה וביותו שוחט בודק. So I think there was kosher slaughterers, bodeks also there. Gam habtiach shchita kshira would actually ensure, let's just say, that there was kosher food, kosher meat, kosher slaughtering. הרב לא לקח כסף מהקהילה על פעולותיו, אלא התקיים מחנות באות ובדים שהקים. So I think he wouldn't take actually a salary even from the Kehillah and do huge undertakings. פעולות של הרב מרדכי יחד עם יתר רבני הקהילה ולמדים שבת עזרו לשמו היהודית משהד. He would actually really try and preserve the Jewish status in משהד. רק יהודים בודדים קיבל עליהם את אסלאמם מרצון. I think there were just not many cases where people might convert to Islam. הרב התכתב עם רבני ירושלים ושלח להם עזרה כספית. וכך כתב לו, and I think he'd actually have correspondence with another famous rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov Shaul Elisha, who would become a chief rabbi, I think, of Israel, of Jerusalem, between the years 1893 to 1906. I think in 1927, Rabbi Ekla would eventually go to the land of Israel. B'maslul avar, Bombay, I think he'd go through India, Bombay, Uba Karch, Sham nifkash im talmidav yotzei hakila. He would actually meet some of his students over there. He died in Jerusalem in the 5th of Tammuz in Heit HaFresh Tzedek Vav, I think in 1933, and he was buried in Har Zeitim, the Mount of Olives, Bereplat. Beno Harav Raphael Ekla Hanhik et Kilat Mashad Lacha Aliyat Aviv Arza, who Shimesh Kerav. So I think his son now over there, Raphael Ekla, would actually continue in his father's footsteps, and after he made Aliyah and become a shochet, he will become a darshan, a mohel, a rabbi that performs circumcision. B'nagatos yitav b'nei ha'ida lepliti yadut b'chora shebarcho brit hamuatzot b'reshit shanot ha'shloshim la'alot ha'arta. Now I think Rav Raphael Ekler would eventually go and make Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael in 1949, if I'm not mistaken. I think he passed away on the 29th of Nisan. This is a week after the Passover festival over there, we have to very much point out. So he wrote great Torah books also, Rabbi Ekler did, including Avodot HaTamid. This was a Siddur on Tefillah Limechol Ki Minhag Sfardim U'Mitzurgam B'Lashon HaParsit. It was in the Persian language in of itself. I think this came out in the year 1908. And there was Olot Shabbat. This was a Siddur on Tefillah Limei Shabbat. I think with regards to Sephardi customs over there, and it was translated, I think, in Persian. And a very, very interesting Siddur. Another one, Siddur Slichot Liyamei Harachamim V'Yamim Noraim Im HaTargum B'Lashon Parath. So in the Persian language, for the Yomim Noraim from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, and also obviously we say Slichot from Rosh Chodesh Elul respectively. Machzor Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim, there was a Haggadah Shel Pesach in Persian. Also we've actually got, I think, Haggadah of Passover in the Persian language, actually in our house in London. Now Rabbi Mordechai katav gam bi'ur לכמה מספרי התנ"ך, לתורה הנביאים והכתובים, ביאור המצוי בכתב יד, ועוד כמה חיבורים שלא זכו לראות אור. ביאורו על התורה יצא לאור בתמוז תשפ"ד. על ידי נינו מנשה ורדי. So I think he would actually have a grandson called Menashe Vardi, if I'm not mistaken. Very interesting. It could be over here. I know a Menashe Vardi, I think here from the city of Bet Shemesh, so I'll have to point that out. So he would actually write a book within regards to that. So that's very, very interesting. Let's speak now a bit more about other communities. The Yazd community. They would come let's now speak a bit about the history with regards to them. They come probably from the Middle Ages, actually reported from Wikipedia. Obviously in the Yazd province, the capital of Yazd, there's archaeological findings, I think from the 9th century if I'm not mistaken. And obviously the most famous rabbi from Yazd, definitely Rav Mola Or Shraga, who we've spoken about before on various occasions before, and we attended his Hilula, and was very, very influential in Iran in his time. The Jews of Yazd were among the first to immigrate and establish communities over there, we have to point out. And much can be said within regards to that. The Jews of Yazd were among the first to immigrate to various different places, maybe to Israel also, and would establish a Yazd synagogue, maybe in Tzfat, if I'm not mistaken. We have to point out over there. Let's speak about the famous Rabbi Mola Or Shraga over here. Very, very important. He was born sometime in the 18th century, and he passed away in the year 1793, I think on 28th of Cheshvan. And we attended his Hilula here on this channel a while ago. He was a Kabbalist, he was a judge, a Dayan, and was, let's say, the spiritual leader of the Persian Jewish community he happened to be. He was a mohel, he was a shochet, kosher slaughterer, and a bodek, and a dayan, we have to point out over here, within regards to that. So it's actually interesting. He was born, seemingly it was towards the start of the 18th century, in Yazd, in Iran. And his father was Rav Shmuel ben Mola Iyat, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. And I think they would live near Mashhad itself, respectively. Mistaber she'avotav shel Or Shraga, he grew liyazd ma'ir za'ar shebetzafon Paras. They were more in the northern part of Iran. Yitzchan Shudi Sabzvar, he grew לשם, מחוז גילען, ומשאבים שמסבים העיר כזיבז over there. ידוע שענדיר שעה, I think it lived between, this was a time period between 1736 1747, ביקש להעביר מספר רב של יהודים ממחוז גילען ומשאבים שמסביב לכזיבב לעיר קלת נדרי, כ-200 קילומטר צפונית למשהד. תרנספר זה עירה כנראה, I think in the year 1747, וחלקו מן העוקרים נתקעו בעיר ספזבר, התיישבו שם. חלק הגיעו למשהד וחלק לקלעת נדרי. אולי זאת הסיבה לקשרים ההדוקים בין יהודי יזד לבין יהודי משהד. Very interesting. I'm just reading this in Hebrew over here. Over מקום אחר, I think from another place, they actually say that maybe his actually forefathers, he descends from David HaMelech, King David, and maybe they actually came even from Poland, if I'm not mistaken, way before, through going through southern Russia to Iran at a way earlier point in time. But there's one theory, I don't know how true that is or how correct that is. Now Rav Shraga would learn Torah, Hanigla Nistar, the highest level Torah. He would work as a mohel, he was a shochet, kosher slaughterer, a bodek, he was a judge, a dayan in Yazd. שמוע התפרסם בקרב היהודים והמסלמים כאחד עקב מעשי ניסים שנקשרו לדמותו. הוא זכה לכינוי מולה. He had the nickname called מולה כתוארים של חכמים השיעים. למד בקביעות עם שני ידידיו, רב דרוויש מהעיר שירז, he would be one of them, רב משה מהעיר קשן. כל מפגש נערך בעיר אחרת לסירוגין. נודע כמתמיד גדול. כאשר היה מתעייף היה מן מנם מעט ממשיך ללמוד, כדי לא לירדם לזמן ממושך. היה מניח שיא נחושת, הפוך על שולחן, ותחתיו נר, ועליו היה מניח את ראשו כעבור זמן. מה השיא היה? מתחמם עד שהיה מעלת. רצו להרים את ראשו, וידו להמשיך בלימודו. Very interesting. Sorry, I just read that in Hebrew over there, so I hope you guys understood that. I'm just reading over here from a source from Wikipedia. I think he passed away on the 28th of Mar Cheshvan in the year 1793, I believe, 31st of October. He was buried, I think, in Yazd. Al-Kibro Nivna, Mo'el Katan, Shabo Na'gu Yodim Ugoyim Litpalel. So it's a place where Jewish people and non-Jewish people come to daven. I think in Toshin Samach Aleph, שופץ מבנה עקבה על ידי מוסלמים שציפה לילדים שני רבות. So I think they would actually do some renovations over there. ונקפיד אחת ולד לציון כפי שיעשו שיעצו לא תושבי העיר יזד. And among his descendants is בין צאצאיו נמנים רבנים רבים, ביניהם הרב יוסף שרגא. Rav Yosef Shraga is a famous rabbi here in modern day. He's a Rab Lemekahalot Aparsiot, Rab Baruch Shraga, another rabbi I think we had the honor, huge honor of getting a bracha of. He's a head of Jewish courts, the Bet Din, if I'm not mistaken, and part of the Munach Shel Amoatzah Hadidit Yerushalayim, if I'm not mistaken. Now, Rav Mola or Shraga, they say over here, Lo Yidu Al Ketavim Shesardu Mimenu Milvad Shtei Igrot. So apparently he's got two famous letters that would actually come about. Hachan Nichtava b'shnat 1782. I think in the year 1782 wrote a letter. Uba b'nei liyudim mashad l'siyeh l'shadar Chacham Eliyahu ma'i Hebron, to help out this specific shluchei Rabbanan, Rabbi Eliyahu from Hebron. And another igeret, let's say letter. Igeret hashniya nichtava in the year 1783. Gam hi liyudim mashad b'igeret bakasha la'alatz yudi b'shem Yitzchak ben Yehuda kohen l'da'og l'farnaso ishto shnitasha l'lo. It's Rabbi Iryaz. Be'igeret zo, harav or shraga mevakesh, sheba mikra she'en atzio efshari, nishlach ha'ba'al get lishto. This is just another thing that's actually written over there. There's various different commemorations in his memory. Al sheno mikra, nikra mispar mostot. There's various different mostot foundations that are named after him, including Torah and the Chinuch, Torah and education ones. Benehem yeshivat Ora Shalom in the Geula neighborhood. This yeshiva is. Then there's Talmud Torah Or Shraga, the Shechnat Bukharim B'Yerushalayim. In the Bukhari neighborhood in Jerusalem, there's a specific Torah academy, a Talmud Torah called the Yeshivat Or Shraga, and also Beit Knesset Yazdim, also at that point in time. I think Betzafon Shechonat Ramot in Ramot Dalet, B'Yerushalayim, Nikra Rehov Al Shemo. There's a name of a road named after him over there also. Midei Shana Ba'askara Noagim Anshe Kilat Yazd. The Shi'at Hashi Shechive Beno, Rabbi Shmuel Shraga. It's very interesting enough. They would commemorate it, and we did have the honor of going to one of the commemorations at one point in time, we have to point out. Let's talk a bit more about the Jewish community of Yazd, for example. It's not necessarily known when they actually came in, but the stories of the first Jews settling in Yazd will go down from generation to generation. The first Jews to arrive in Yazd were four brothers with their families, who were, I think, exiled from Isfahan, if I'm not mistaken, and they were royal ministries. And following, there was a plot of Gentiles. They were sentenced to death, and after some discussion, their sentence was commuted, and they had to be exiled to the desert and isolated Yazd. On the way to Yazd, they experienced various difficulties, including violent robberies and danger to their lives in the forest. But despite everything, they would insist on performing the commandments and observing the Shabbat with great devotion. Initially, Jews were not allowed to enter the city of Yazd, and they would settle near a city or building that had previously served as a barn. They renovated and adopted it to living conditions, and even built buildings in the area until it became a real neighborhood. The neighborhood was named Mir Maved, after Miriam, one of the four siblings, who was a living spirit, and I think this great Miriam would actually contribute greatly to raising the morale and even helped with great wisdom to improve physical conditions. There was an emerging community was unable to, let's say, obtain a Torah scroll at that point in time because of bandits who would lay in the wait on the roads. And the first scroll was brought from Isfahan by someone named Yocheved, another of the four siblings, obviously. sorry, by Yocheved, yeah. And Yocheved volunteered to bring Torah scrolls and, let's just say, alone, as the bandits would not harm women. The community also rewarded her at that point in time and established Yocheved synagogue in her name, we have to point out over there. I think another neighborhood called the Ahar Son was built, and in addition, Jewish people began to be allowed to build houses within the city, so that Jews were consecrated in 3 different locations. When one of the Jews saved the hated king, he asked in return to concentrate Abashar the first, the Jews within the city, and thus the Jews were concentrated in the city in 2 neighborhoods, the upper street and the lower street, with a market between them. From various testimonies, I think can be concluded that there was no close connection between the residents of the upper and lower neighborhoods. I think the lower street had a more rural character, while upper street had an urban bourgeois character in of itself. Now, there was occupation of the Jews. Most of the Jews living in Yazd were more, let's say, poor, and had to make a living from various ways, including the Silk Road they had to pass through. The trade city in Yazd was an important source of income for the Jews, and joined numerous trade caravans. Yazd obviously is located on the edge of the innkeeping desert and served as a transit and rest spot. This allowed the local residents, including the Jews, to earn a living from various services they provided to passerby and animals, such as feeding provisions from the journey and even security services for the caravans. Namely, I think on the lower street, the silk industry, let's say, were engaged in growing mulberry trees. As for silkworms and spinning threads, by an habitat female workforce reported over. So we did speak about the Mullah or Shraga. He was a famous Mohel sheriff judge of the Jewish community in the 18th century. I think he helped the Jews of the community keep in contact with the Jews of the land of Israel, and even maintain contact with Gentiles who considered him a righteous man. So we did say why he was called a Mullah over here, which is a great title. As a Muslim religious scholar, Rabbi was called by the Yazdis Mullah, the first light. But he always said, I am only Shraga, meaning a small light, so you can see his humility. When he died, obviously many would visit his grave, and including Gentiles over there. His image remained engraved in the hearts of all those who came from Yazd, and he's one of the, I guess, the most famous people from that place in that time. Now, there's many traditions coming from the Yazd community that remain related to his character and his being a righteous, exemplary man. For example, after the passing of Rabbi Shraga, his servant claimed that the rabbi would study Torah on Shabbat with the prophet Elijah, and that he would also meet with 2 regular rabbis to study Torah together. This is Rabbi Moshe of Shiraz, Darwish from the city, who came to him from Kishan from the city. And I think the Baal Shem Tov was a friend from a distance. Baal Shem Tov knew who he was. Very, very interesting indeed. And one day I think there was a man named Chacham Eliyahu from Hebron would arrive in the Yazd community and would have a correspondence with Rav Mullah or Shraga, if I'm not mistaken. And this was maybe connected to one of the famous Sigerets, one of the famous letters with regards to Or Shraga. Let's talk about some additional rabbis from Yazd. At the time of his death, Rav Mullah or Shraga announced to those gathered at his bedside that he was dividing his duties between 2 of his sons. Rav Shmuel would take on responsibilities and maybe with regards to law and the Dainut, and Rav Moshe was responsible for b'dikot, examination, and slaughtering, kosher slaughtering, and circumcisions as a mohel. And they would continue to lead the Jewish community of Yazd since then. I think there was a charitable organization founded by the Kamal Synagogue is named after him, with the aim of helping any Jew who encountered difficulties with authorities, with neighboring Gentiles, or settling, let's say, disputes, assisting the needy and the helpless. I think the organization itself had members from a number of people who contributed their money and energy into the success of this specific cause over here. Let's talk a bit about Isfahan now over here. The Jewish community history. According to oral tradition preserved among the Jews of Isfahan, the community refers to those who were exiled by the kingdom of Judah. I think, if it's not mistaken, this tradition appears in the writings of the Yakut Arab scholars, if I'm not mistaken, over there. Now, there was Safavid dynasty time period. Isfahan was, let's just say, talked about and it became like a capital center, Isfahan did at that point in time, a little Jerusalem and Judea. And very, very interesting enough. So we did speak about this, I think, in the previous class over here. And the Nadir Shah, we spoke all about Nur al-Hakim and so on and so forth over there at that point in time. The Tehran Jewish community is one of the most important and significant Jewish communities of Iranian communities over there, we have to point out. The city would develop as an important center around the 18th century and become the capital of the kingdom of the Qajar dynasty. Earliest evidence of Jewish community, I think David the Bit, would actually speak about it. He was a traveler, I think, and it was around 1828, if I'm not mistaken. During the 19th century, other rabbis visited. Rabbi J. Wolf, Benjamin II in Newmark, described the development and the growth of the city's population. The Jews of Tehran were mainly engaged in crafts, let's say petty trade, and were dealing with carpets, fabrics, antiques, and encountered, let's say, restrictions both economically and socially due to the Schleit's perception of their impurity. However, one of the community, let's say, areas of excellence was medicine. Jewish doctors would gain a reputation there, especially someone named J. Pollock, who was an Austrian Jew, was appointed a professor at the Tehran Medical School and consulting physician to the Shah in 1850s. In the second half of the 19th century, the status of the Jews improved following the diplomatic great philanthropist Moses Montefiore, his intervention by figures such as in 1906 under the reforms of Adolf Kalmiak, who we spoke about before, and of Muzaffardan Shah. Jews were granted full citizenship, and over the time they were allowed to send representatives to the parliament at that point in time. So very, very interesting. And we can talk all about other famous figures over there, especially at the time period of the Balfour Declaration, and with regards to the founding of the Jewish communities in Tehran, especially in the early part of the 20th century. There was a famous intellectual and author, someone named Shlomo Cohen Sedek, who was a proper community leader over there. He would be a writer, write Hebrew grammar books in Persian, I think in other languages also. Now the famous Rav Aziz Naim, who was a Zionistic journalist and rabbi, I believe, and various other people who actually come from Tehran over here. So very, very interesting. You know what, we're going to speak, I wanted to speak about maybe one famous figure before we wrap up today's special edition over here, friends. And friends, just to point out, we're a community here, so anyone tuning in, welcome to our community, and hope all is well. I wanted to speak a bit about Chaim Mora. He was seemingly, I think he was a rabbi. He was another famous Persian rabbi who I don't think we've spoken about yet inside this series. I think Rav Chaim Mora would live, I'm not sure when he passed away exactly. It might have been 1872, or maybe he was born, but we don't know when he was passed away. I think he was born in 1872. He was a rabbi, he was a posek, he was a poet, he was an author, he was a translator, and was a famous Iranian Jew. נחשב לדמות מרכזית ביהודית איראן במחצית הראשונה של המאה. From the 20th century, was earlier part of the 20th century, was known as one of the famous rabbis there. ובמיוחד כמי שחיבר תרגם ופירוש טקסטים תורניים ודתיים בפרסית יהודית תוך שימוש באותיות עבריות over there. I think he was born in 1872, seemingly passed away in 1942, 70 years of age. Interesting enough, so he was very, very well decorated in of itself. So let's speak a bit more. Apparently didn't have don't know if total eyesight or partial eyesight. נודע בזיכרונו החריף. He had a brilliant memory. ביצירתו הנפה ובתרומתו להשכלה הדתית והעברית של קהילת יהודי איראן. Now, I think Chaim Mora was born in the year 1872, the rabbi was, in Tehran, למשפחה יהודית מסורתית. בגיל שנתיים, when he was 2 years old, חלה באבוות שחורות. I think he would get some sort of מחלה, ובעקבות המחלה איבד את ראייתו, so he would lose his eyesight, partially or totally at that point in time. עובדה שהשפיעה על מהלך חייו, אך לא מנעה ממנו להפוך לדמות תורנית מובילה. אביו, חאג' מרדכי, בן עליה שירזי, נפטר כאשר היה בן 7 בלבד. לאחר מוות אביו, גדל בעיקר ביתו של סבו מצד אמו, ידגר, בן שלמה אספהגני over there. So very, very interesting enough. So I think it was in 1898 עם פתיחתו של בית ספר Alliance. I think this time period when the Alliance school system was opened right at the end of the 19th century in Tehran. הוזמן חיים מורה ללמד מקצועות דתיים ושפה עברית. They would start teaching Hebrew language at that time. When he was 26 years of age, בהיותו בן 26, החל לעסוק בהוראה בבית הספר. He would start educating in the school itself. ותוך כדי כך למד גם את השפה הצרפתית, learn French. כישורו האינטלקטואליים, intellectually, זיכרונו חריף יכולותיו, הלשונות עוררו התפעלות. It was very, very sharp, especially languages. הוא שינן בעל פה את מולו טקסתי התורה, ספר תהילים, ספר זוהר, תפילות היום והחג, ואף עסק לימוד מסתלקה יהדות נוצרה ומוסלמית. כמו כן רכש בקיאות נרחבת בפילוסופיה מזרחית ומערבית, learn philosophy also, והחזיק בידו מעמיק בספרות הפרסית. מורה אף חיבר שירים אטלטיים, writes various different songs in himself, והושפע במיוחד מהוגים ומשירים פרסיים כמו שב עדין סור הוורדי, al חוסין בן מנסור, al חגלג, and various others also, רומי. כבר הושפיע מהמשוררים היהודים פרסיים, אמרני ומעלנה שחין. So we're talking about how he was inspired. מורה כתב לרוב בעברית וצרפתית, ולעיתים הכתיב את כתביו לאוזן בפרסית יהודית. בין תלמידים ומייסדים בכתיבתו נמנו דמויות בולטות כגון סלימון חיים, שלמה כהן צדק. These were famous people that would actually follow him. עומר ברסה, מנהל בית ספר של כל ישראל, the Alliance school system. He was a manager. I think in 1935, בשנת 1935, ביקר בטהרן האוגרף וחוקר ירושלמי אברהם יעקב ברבה. He would actually visit Tehran במסגרת מסע מחכה לפרס, investigating in regards to the Jewish community of Persia. ברבה הקדיש פסקה נלהבה לזכרו של חכם חיים מורה. אותו פרסם ביומן מפרשת מסויות בפרס. I think in 1938 he will actually give a whole quotation of it, which I'm not going to say now. Now this famous rabbi will write various different books, including Derech Hayim. I think in 1921 it happened to have been. Over here we have to point out. Now friends, we're just going to take a short break as we're going to conclude the video in a minute and learn about more with regards to Okay, yeah, thanks everyone. We're just going to conclude just in the next 2 minutes over here, this special series over here. He wrote different books, the Derech Hayim, the Gedolot Mordechai. Gedolot Mordechai was, I think, under the name of his father, Mordechai itself. So the Derech Hayim was 292 pages, which was written in Judeo-Persian, we have to point out over there. And another famous book. Then there was Luach Shana Ivri, I think he would actually do a Hebrew calendar in 1924, if I'm not mistaken, a famous one. And Shirim, Mokoriyim, Ivrit, Parsiet, and Pri Ato, and Be'inat Mora, I think, which is in 1928, which was, I think, his last book, which was, I think, mostly in Persian. It was talking about Musar and so on and so forth over there. Very, very interesting enough. So I think when he was 20, he got married to his wife Lana Bolnadim, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I've got the right name right. I think they would have they would have 3 daughters, and the son Abram or Ibrahim was a teacher, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm not too sure. I'll have to double check on that also. So very, very interesting. There was a couple of other figures we're going to try and speak about in the next class over here. It would be interesting to know if anyone knows information on them, including Shlomo Cohen Tzedek, who was a famous person at that point in time. He passed away in 1964, born in 1891. He was a famous historian, a sofer, and someone very famous in the Persian Kahila. And another famous figure was someone of the name, if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi Azizallah Naim, who we didn't speak about before. I think he passed away in 1946. He was born in the year 1889, also respectively, so that's something else. Thank you very much. have to point out over here, friends. And friends, we explored the Jewish community history here of Iran. And very interesting. It was the third part of the series. And we hope we can do more parts over here in due course. We've already recorded 3 parts. We've recorded about 45 Jewish countries already here inside the series, which is a phenomenal achievement, friends, over here. And we're really very much going from strength to strength over here. Now, friends, we're a community. We love exploring about Jewish community histories from all over the world. We've spoken about 45 countries already, which is absolutely amazing. Hopefully we're going to speak about many more. And we're just growing in history and so on and so forth. We've already recorded a history, possibly about 40 Persian rabbis of different years. That's something else I'd very much have to point out over here, and I would very much recommend everyone to watch over those presentations we did over there, and to just learn more within regards to the Jewish community history and so on and so forth over here. And they're just recording this here on a beautiful day here in the city of Bet Shemesh, from Bet Shemesh Aleph to be precise over here. And anyone you're in Israel, come visit me. And I can talk. We did little tours all over Israel. That's another special thing we've done here inside this channel, inside this presentation. And hopefully Bezrat Hashem we can do much more importances in of itself. So everyone, thank you for watching and being patient. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and have a great day. Thanks.